due process and true equal protection and true fairness in that courtroom. I look back at my career, it's been decades. I've tried cases around the country. I've tried white-collar cases. I've tried non-white-collar cases. I've been in state court. I've been in federal court. And I have never seen a trial as unfair as this. Mr. Cosby did not get what he deserved in that courtroom for a lot of reasons, political reasons, legal reasons, and everyone in America has a right to a fair trial, and he didn't get one. And I want to say this, he was the nicest client to work with, very dignified person, very intelligent, very accomplished, very respectful. It was an honor to work for him, and he was a very, very decent client to be around.
You know, considering what was on the line, every time that I met with him, spoke with him, dealt with him, he was very entertaining, very funny, very pleasant, always maintained his sense of humor.
He really did, and he treats people in a very decent way. He's a very, very accomplished, intelligent, nice person to be around. He should have gotten a fair trial, and he didn't. And I hope courts of appeal see that for what it is. I mean, even years before this trial took place, he was treated unfairly. You had a district attorney who made a decision not to prosecute him. He called it an agreement. And because the prior district attorney had agreed not to prosecute Mr. Cosby, he was informed that he had to give a civil deposition in a related civil case.
Sure.
That DA who agreed not to prosecute him had run against an opponent who turned out to be our trial judge.
Right.
And when that DA lost his next race to the current DA decided to just basically throw out the door the agreement the prior DA had made. And defense lawyers for Mr. Cosby raised this issue. And they had to have a hearing before our trial judge, who had been the opponent of the prior DA and had lost. And the trial judge, who had been his opponent, ruled that he was not, he didn't accept his testimony, that there was a binding agreement. So we start off with a very bizarre, politically driven process that I don't think was fair at all.
Well, and Kevin Steele actually used part of this as his campaign, too, which is a little bizarre, that if I'm elected, I'm going to go after Mr. Cosby.
Well, for people who don't know, Kevin Steele is the current district attorney who prosecuted Mr. Cosby. And he was the one who chose not to follow the agreement his political opponent, the prior district attorney, had entered into with Mr. Cosby's lawyers.
Right.
So you start off with a very strange set of events. I mean, prosecutors are held to high ethical standards. If a prosecutor tells someone, I'm not charging you, that should be worth its weight in gold. You don't just suddenly have it become a political football, and when the prosecutor who enters into that agreement loses, and suddenly his opponent says, well, I'm not going to follow what he said. There's something wrong with that. That's not the way justice in America is supposed to be. And so you have this agreement not to prosecute him. He relies on it, and turns out it's not enforceable, according to the next DA. So that, right off the bat, is a strange series of events. Mr. Cosby enters into a civil settlement. He doesn't admit wrongdoing in the civil settlement. The deposition that he was told he had to take because he wasn't being prosecuted is sealed. And then another judge decides to unseal it.
Federal judge.
Federal judge, exactly. And a federal court of appeals basically says the judge didn't act properly, but it's too late. So suddenly that deposition that was supposed to be sealed becomes evidence in the case. That's absurd. But it keeps getting worse. We entered into jury selection. One juror or potential juror that was removed, complained that another potential juror had made a comment that Mr. Cosby was guilty.
Right.
The other potential juror denied making that comment, by the way. But nevertheless, we did have this complaint, and the judge would not follow our request and remove that particular juror to ensure a fair jury.
Right.
So that happens. Then, of course, the Me Too movement, which is a very powerful social movement in America, sort of starts roaring through society. And in Mr. Cosby's first trial, the trial judge allowed one additional accuser, not the main accuser, to testify against Mr. Cosby. That ended in a hung jury. Then you have the Me Too movement roaring through society, very powerful, very emotional. And by the way, anyone who says we must do what we can to prevent sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, sexual assault, no one can argue with that. The problem is when social movements, really as powerful as this, take off, you have to be careful that our justice system is not negatively affected. So the movement takes off and we have a retrial and the judge decides to allow not just one other so-called accuser, but 5. He ups the number from 1 to 5. These are people that Mr. Cosby isn't even charged, it never has been charged with doing anything improper to. So the judge won't give any reasons. He just decides to up the number from 1 to 5.
But correct me if I'm wrong, in the first trial, the woman that they allowed to testify, it was based on a time frame and apparently it went back, I believe, like to 1996, but when she testified, it reverted back to actually 1990 was the date. And then in the second trial, for whatever reason, he just went back to 1982.
Well, the judge allowed women to come in to say they'd been improperly treated by Mr. Cosby, allegations that are going back 30 years.
Right.
Allegations that were never made at the time, that were never, in my opinion, properly investigated. And suddenly you're cluttering the trial with these accusers. And it even gets worse from there because 2 of the 5 additional accusers made emotional attacks on Mr. Cosby in the trial. One said words to the effect, he was a serial rapist.
Right.
Judge wouldn't grant us a mistrial. Another looked at Mr. Cosby, said words to the effect, you know what you did? Totally improper, in my opinion. Judge wouldn't grant a mistrial. It was just one bizarre event after another. You had the judge allowed in evidence of particular drug use that was not justified by any of the testimony, in my opinion.
And wasn't even a factor in Constance's issue.
Well, I'm not here to disparage any individual. I'm not going to criticize anyone who testified. I'm here to talk about the trial, which was very, very unfair. It was so unfair that I'm still just reeling from the process.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff that was going on behind the scenes that I wasn't privy to simply because a lot of the stuff that was done in chambers. We have to go to a break, but we'll be back shortly and see if we can take some calls. Thanks. Talking about, we were talking about the trial and what was going on, but if you want to.
Well, I mean, there are endless problems with the case. I mean, the judge would cut off the defense cross-examination, and by comparison, in my opinion, let the prosecutors cross-examine on and on and on, in my opinion, sending a message that the judge wanted to favor the prosecution. They're basically, in closing argument, the prosecutor did what we call in the profession personally vouch for his position. In other words, there are ethical principles which suggest that a lawyer cannot make it a personal issue in their argument. They can argue vigorously, they can argue passionately, but you're not allowed to what we call personally vouch. And the prosecutor, in my opinion, personally vouched throughout his closing argument. It was so outrageous. We had asked for a mistrial, that was denied. If you put all of this together, and there are many other things. We had a statute of limitations defense, meaning this case had to be filed within a certain period of time. And we proved that it wasn't filed within a certain period of time. We had travel records, we had itineraries, we had phone records, flight records that you, Scott, really put together meticulously.
I was going to say, and that I was very actively involved in.
Well, you were actively involved in every aspect of the case. I wanted you in the case because you're the best investigator in the United States. That's why I wanted you in it. That's why I wanted you in Michael Jackson, and that's why you're such a great investigator. But in this particular case, there was a very valid defense that this case had not been filed in time. And we made a motion to that effect, requested an evidentiary hearing. Judge wouldn't grant the evidentiary hearing and wouldn't rule on the motion. He said, I'll send it to the jury. By law, he had a right to send the jury what is called a special interrogatory, where they would have to decide, did the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this case was filed in time? Judge wouldn't do that. He read a jury instruction to the jury to the effect that they must find beyond a reasonable doubt that the prosecution timely filed the case, and never sent that instruction into the jury room. We spent a lot of time going through every single day when Mr. Cosby allegedly committed this act, and he wasn't in Pennsylvania at the time. Right. That was basically scuttled and not treated properly. I think there are going to be so many issues on appeal in this case. I can't imagine how the American legal system will allow a conviction in a trial like this to stand up. Unfortunately, in the meantime, Mr. Cosby has to go through, at the age of 81, a lot of pain, a lot of discomfort, and he knows, and we all know who defended him, that this was not a fair trial. And all we ask for at this point is let him go to trial again and make it be fair. Make him subject to all of the protections, all of the immunities, all of the benefits of the best legal system in the world, the United States legal system. He did not have that in this case, and that's what we want.
It's a question I get all the time is how do you do this? How do you defend people that you believe that, and I'm certainly not saying that you or I think that Mr. Cosby is guilty, but you get that question. If you know somebody is guilty, how do you defend them? And the response that I always give is that we're defending the Constitution. We're just basically making sure that the police or the prosecution follow the law. And this is a classic example. It's not really at this point an issue of whether or not Mr. Cosby did anything. The issue is that the government has opted to not follow the law in this particular case.
Well, Mr. Cosby has always maintained his innocence from day one.
Sure.
He's never wavered. He's always maintained that anything he did was consensual and perfectly lawful, and he's never wavered from that position. I know people disagree with him, and that's their right. But whether you believe someone's guilty or don't believe someone's guilty, they have a right to a fair trial in America.
Absolutely.
And America has gone through periods where, because of very powerful social movements taking over society and affecting people's emotions, where our system has been challenged. And the people who have consistently stood up to make our system work have been criminal defense attorneys. I mean, I'll never forget early in my education reading about John Adams, who became president of the United States. Sure. But before he became president, he was a respected lawyer in Boston.
Defended
during the Boston massacre, where British troops assassinated American citizens, he saw this groundswell of public opinion condemning all of the British troops, including a lot of young men who basically were following orders and doing whatever they did. And he volunteered to defend a number of these young men. He said, wait a second, they're being swept up in this groundswell of emotion and public opinion, and they're not going to get a fair trial unless somebody really stands up for them. And he did, and a number of his clients were acquitted. They were young British soldiers who nobody could prove murdered anybody. We've had other periods. Just because people are highly educated and have power and have an ability to articulate doesn't mean they're right. A lot of people don't realize that early in American history, for a period of time, it was a misdemeanor for a white to kill a black. It was a felony if a black killed a white. Black people were not allowed to be witnesses against white people in criminal trials. And it's not just the fact that we had laws like this that is so horrible. It's that very bright judges who were graduated from the top law schools, wrote very learned, very logical, very, very educated opinions that came to the conclusions that these were correct, that it was okay, that if a white killed a black, it was a misdemeanor. If a black killed a white, it was a felony. There were so many laws that were just the product of bigotry and prejudice and emotion that educated judges and educated people accepted and validated. We had, before World War II, you remember Japanese people were rounded up and put in internment camps.
Absolutely.
Their homes were foreclosed on. Their businesses failed. This was another emotional groundswell involving fear and passion and emotion. And in periods like this, where we have a powerful social movement that has drawn the emotions and passions of so many people, we have to step back and say this should not affect our justice system. Everybody is innocent until proven guilty, and everybody has a right to a fair trial. And in my opinion, because of numerous reasons, some of which I haven't even articulated yet, Bill Cosby never got a fair trial, and he deserves one.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And it kept going after the war, even McCarthyism, and it's always been going on. There's always one thing or another.
Oh, there was a period of time, if you were at all associated with the Communist Party, you
Sure.
couldn't get employment, you couldn't get a fair trial.
Sure.
Jurors would walk into court prejudiced against you. This is, a human reality that we always have to guard against. And fortunately and correctly, criminal defense lawyers from the earliest days of our country have stood up and said, look, passion and emotion and groundswell of feelings, whether right or wrong, threaten what happens in our courtrooms. And we've got to be extra careful during periods like this to make sure that excessive feeling about one thing doesn't result in injustice.
I remember when we did Robert Blake, the judge, the original judge that with whom you did the prelim in front of, allowed cameras in the courtroom, and Harlan's interpretation was he had big case-itis, and that also had a major impact on how the case was handled, and yet you continued to allow the cameras in there. You didn't do any objection.
Well, I mean, the question of whether cameras belong in a courtroom is, to me, very case-specific. When I was defending Robert Blake in that preliminary hearing, and he was charged with murder with special circumstances, which meant he could actually face the death penalty at that point.
And could not get bail.
By law, he was not permitted to get bail in a murder with special circumstances case. At least that's what people thought at that point. I wanted cameras because I wanted people to see how weak this case was against Robert Blake. I wanted them to see how problematic these witnesses were for the prosecution. And I really felt that if we went after these people hard, good things would come to Mr. Blake. And what happened as a result of that televised preliminary hearing, he got bail. It's the only time in a murder with special circumstances case in California anyone's gotten bail over prosecution objection. In my opinion, public opinion did change because people I knew at Court TV said going into the preliminary hearing, 80+% thought he was guilty, and coming out of it, 80+% thought he was not guilty. We preserved on videotape the impeachment of these prosecution witnesses, and that videotape could be used at trial. We got the co-defendant and the conspiracy charge thrown out.
That's what I was going to say, and shortly after the trial,
Earl
Caldwell was
dismissed. Cameras in the courtroom is an issue. We'll never really have the answer to whether they belong there or don't belong there. There's the argument that trials are supposed to be public. There's also the argument that cameras in a courtroom can make people change on the witness stand, allow people to watch what's going on in court before they testify, could affect public opinion in negative ways. So that's an open issue that will never be put to bed.
Pennsylvania apparently just doesn't allow cameras no matter what in a courtroom.
Well, in the Michael Jackson case, I didn't want cameras in the courtroom. I just felt it would add to the circus-like environment. Again, I didn't want witnesses seeing what other witnesses were saying on TV before they showed up.
It really was a circus.
And absolutely, that was a wild situation.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we have to constantly fight the battle of ensuring that fairness takes place in courtrooms. People have to remember that a trial, in a sense, is not reality. It's a recreation of reality. It's a recreation of reality because we have to have a justice system. And the rules are constantly changing to try and make it better, which of course means it's not a perfect system. And to come in years later and call witnesses and ask them what they remember seeing or hearing or doing,
20, 30 years later.
To go back 30 years is utterly ridiculous. As I said before, in my opinion, to allow those 5 witnesses in under those circumstances ensured that Mr. Cosby would not get a fair trial. That, on top of all the other instances I've identified, including some that I haven't even gone into, the man was not treated fairly, and he deserves a right to a fair, honorable, professional trial. He has a right to due process. It was denied him in that courtroom.
Yeah. There were a lot of attorneys in that courtroom. I mean, everybody had a specific job. Becky James was obviously there for purposes of the appeal, and two of the younger attorneys that were also there, Jaya Gupta and Gupta. And
we had an excellent
Robinson.
Defense team.
Yeah,
I mean, Kathleen Bliss, Becky James, Rachel Robinson, Jaya Gupta, Jason Hicks. These are first-class attorneys,
right?
And all believed in what we were doing, and
worked together very well.
Worked together very well.
Yeah.
We all believed that Mr. Cosby had to be treated fairly, and we all believed that he was not. And it's going to have to work itself through higher courts, in my opinion, and hopefully sanity will prevail. And when politics are stripped from this equation, I think the truth will come out, and that is that this man was not treated fairly at all.
The appellate process, they're not really looking for, they're not looking to reverse the verdict, but just give Mr. Cosby a fair trial.
Well, we're not in the appellate process yet.
Well,
he has to be sentenced.
After
you
that,
can't file an appeal till after
sentencing.
And then there may be, he has new counsel now, and there probably will be some motions filed in the near future. That'll all be up to new counsel.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon for people to get new counsel once.
No. Everyone charged with a crime in America has a right to counsel their choice. It's not unusual for lawyers to be replaced. It's a very, very stressful, very, very emotional situation. And I've always said that practicing law is an art, not a science. And people look at it differently, and it's not unusual to replace lawyers and get another opinion.
Right.
So what Mr. Cosby did was perfectly appropriate and perfectly understandable.
Yeah, not uncommon at all.
No.
And it was more difficult too in this particular case with the issues that the Cosby family were going through with the loss of their daughter. That was tragic.
Terrible tragedy. Yeah, all of our hearts went out for the Cosby family when that happened. And they have had their share of tragedy. They've had their share of success. In my opinion, a very nice family. Mrs. Cosby, lovely person. Mr. Cosby, delightful to work with. And I wish them all the very best. And they deserve justice. They didn't get it.
Yeah, there was so much bad publicity and speculation that because Mrs. Cosby wasn't there through the entire thing until ultimately it came out that she was with her daughter, and rightfully so. Again, and unfortunately, even though the jury is sequestered, I know that they still do things along the way. They stop along the way. They get,
Well, the media can be very, very nasty. The media can be very vicious, and the media can create conditions which make it harder to get a fair trial because they try to condense 8 hours of testimony on a particular day into a soundbite or two. And you can't do that. The trial process is a very, very demanding, very exacting process. And jurors are under oath to consider all that they see or hear in that courtroom and to follow the rules. The media are not so restrained. They're not under oath. Right. They can report whatever they want, and they typically try to make it sensational and exciting, and very often they distort what's really happening.
Yeah, I learned that this morning on some releases about the show, that the media is distorting what is really taking place. One of the other issues with the media is they have their own interpretation of what was going on, and it was as if in the courtroom they were separated, like the sort of pro prosecution was on one side, the pro defense was on the other side. I don't know if you've even noticed that.
Well, that's very typical, though. I mean, very often people who support the prosecution sit on their side. People who support the defense sit on the defense side. That's not unusual.
Yeah, it's like being at a bad wedding.
Well, I mean, I was focusing on the judge and the witnesses,
sure,
and basically not looking behind me all that much. So I try to block that stuff out and focus on what I have to do.
So I have to ask for my own curiosity, since I wasn't allowed back in chambers. What exactly? Was it getting heated back there? Was everybody being pretty reasonable?
It depended on the situation. There were some arguments in chambers. Chambers means you're in the judge's office, basically.
Right.
You're not in public view. Sometimes arguments got very heated. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes people were very professional, and sometimes they weren't. I can't really just describe in any single way would happen in those discussions.
Kathleen stormed back there a couple times, and she looked like she was going to take somebody out.
Kathleen Bliss is a very tough, terrific lawyer.
No doubt.
She's a former federal prosecutor, spent 20 years with the Justice Department. I had handled a case with her previously, and she was brilliant, and she did a fabulous job.
Yeah. She was interesting to work with, to say the least. But like I said, I saw her go back there a couple times, and I think Jason was even afraid to go back there when she got to that boiling point. So the other thing I also wanted to bring up, you do a lot of work in Alabama, or in the South. I shouldn't just limit it to Alabama, but I know that you've done a lot of death penalty cases in Alabama. You won one recently, and I know you do a lot of pro bono work, and you have the clinic that most people are not aware of. Sunday, is it every other Sunday?
Through much of my career, I volunteered at free legal clinics, primarily in South Los Angeles. And most of them were run by churches. And after the Michael Jackson victory, my name was bigger than it had been before, and I decided it was time to have my own. So we started the Mesereau Free Legal Clinic, which is still in existence. It meets 2 weekends a month, 2 Saturdays a month. And lawyers, law students, college students, activists donate their time to help the poor, to help people who can't afford legal advice, or at least can't afford good legal advice. And people will come with whatever problem it is. It could be a criminal problem. It could be a civil problem, divorce, wills, business disputes, landlord-tenant. And we do our best to help them. We encourage them to come back and always freely talk to us, and we'll help them any way we can. We can't solve every problem, obviously.
Sure.
But we can be there to try and direct people, to try and help them. And sometimes we direct them to particular lawyers, or we direct them to other organizations. There are organizations that deal with low-cost divorce, for example, in South Los Angeles. There are organizations that will help people with child custody issues. There are many, many fine lawyers and law students and professors and judges even come to help out. And I always tell people nobody loses in this situation. The people who need help get it. The lawyers elevate their spirit and their morals and their values in a way that many people don't think lawyers are capable of, because we have a bad reputation in some quarters. But the fact is, there are good people out there who are trying to help society and trying to use their educational ticket in a good way, in a positive way. So the Mesereau Free Clinic is still alive and well, and meets at a church in South Los Angeles.
You can say where, the AME church, correct?
It's not AME anymore. No, I for years donated my time at the First African Methodist Episcopal Church Free Legal Clinic, but after the Jackson case, I started my own. That has been at a couple of churches. It was at Brookings AME Church.
Well, if somebody wants to look it up or find it or
There's
attend
a Mesereau Free Legal Clinic website.
Okay.
We'll give you the address and the schedule. And we'd love to see you if you need assistance. And if you need someone to talk to, we try to do our best. As I said, it's all volunteer. Nobody gets paid. We can't be miracle workers all the time, but we can try our best. And as far as the South goes, for almost 20 years now, I've been going down south doing a free murder case on average 1 a year. Some of them have been death penalty cases. Some of them they agreed not to seek death. It's been one of the highlights of my career. I work with Charlie Salvaggio, a brilliant lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama, one of my friends.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you pick and choose, or how do you decide which cases is it?
Charlie and I get together periodically and talk about what case I'm going to try with him, and works out very well. We know each other very well. We've been trying cases together for 20 years. I've never taken a dime for one of them. I pay my travel and my room and board. They truly are pro bono cases. I did one in Mississippi as well, but the rest have all been in Alabama. And it's been another high point of my professional career. We lawyers have to understand that we're very educated and we're very blessed with opportunities. We have to give back when we can.
Sure. But when you get a call for a case, I mean, is there well, I guess, what are the factors that you use to determine whether or not it's something that you'll
We'll
take?
talk about what the charges are and what kind of evidence there is.
Because I know you, and you're not going to just take a case that you think, oh, I can win this, so I'll take it.
No,
Yeah, that's not you.
That's not a criteria.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. So how do you make that
I don't
decision?
cherry pick my cases.
Exactly.
I know lawyers who do, and I'm not one of them.
And that's my point, that it's not you to say, oh, that's a loser, I'm not getting involved. That's not you. So I'm saying, what would be the criteria? Is it just a matter of scheduling?
It depends on what we think. No, not scheduling. What we think the evidence is. Mm-hmm. Do we think there's injustice in the case? Do we think this case was properly vetted by the prosecution before they decided to bring it? And obviously my schedule factors in too. Sure. But we try to continue cases so that I can get down there and do the trial that I want to do.
Yeah, I would actually think the more difficult the case appears to be, the more inclined you would be to take it.
Some people think I'm a little crazy in that regard, but I'm very proud to make this system work. I'm very proud to be a criminal defense lawyer. I'm very proud that when most of society is clamoring for one direction, that we stand up and say, be careful. Don't whittle away civil liberties. Don't whittle away due process. Don't whittle away people's freedoms. Don't treat them with bias and prejudice. I think that we're in a very proud profession. I'm happy to be a criminal defense lawyer. Very proud of what my colleagues do.
You know what you don't know, because I didn't bother you with it at the time, is Harlan Braun and I had a case that was reversed on appeal. It was a murder. The kid was sentenced to life without possibility, got out of prison while we were in trial in
congratulations on your great work.
Yeah, and again, like you said, I'm very, very proud of that fact.
Well, Harlan Braun's a great lawyer. Well, I have to call him up and ask him about it.
Yeah, I don't want to get into his privacy as far as the client, but yeah, I was very proud of that fact. In fact, I was actually a little upset that I couldn't be there to go pick him up from custody. I had worked that out with his parents.
You both did great work, obviously.
Yeah, very happy with that. Again, it was a murder. He was convicted of, life without possibility, and now he's home.
Well, there are wrongful convictions every year.
As was this, exactly.
I mean, I think over 300 people have been released from prison because DNA evidence proved they were wrongfully convicted. And that's a lot of people. People whose lives were shattered, their families' lives were shattered. And, you can assume that there are a lot of cases without DNA where people have been falsely identified. And, it's not a perfect system, and we need people to make it work. And that's what we criminal defense lawyers do.
I actually, if I may, just got a question from James, who wants to know why you didn't go with an out-of-town jury as the prior attorneys.
That's a matter of strategy that I don't want to talk about.
Yeah, that's fine.
So much of what we do is confidential, and I'd rather not get into that.
Okay, fair enough. That's why I said. I mean, I said we're willing to take calls, but we're not gonna compromise anything that has to do with Mr. Cosby in the case. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's nice when you have those victories, and not so much the victory in and of itself, but when you see that the system is actually working. And it's very disappointing when you see that the system is not working, when you have somebody simply is innocent and is convicted.
Well, there's no reason to deny someone a fair trial. We have a very proud system. It's been going on for decades and decades and decades. We are constantly looking for ways to improve it. And there's no reason to deny anyone in America a fair trial, and that's what happened with Mr. Cosby. It's very unfortunate, very sad. I think there was a groundswell of political and social pressure that impacted the courtroom in ways that should not have happened. And he deserves justice. He didn't get it.
Yeah. Do you have any opinion of the defense individual? Again, I'm avoiding names. The defense individual going and talking to the media at all? I mean, that's not your style either, to have communication with the media, but yet they had their own.
I don't know what you're referring to be honest with you.
Well, Andrew Wyatt was out there holding these.
Well, Andrew's a friend of mine and a brilliant publicist, and a very loyal, dedicated man, dedicated to Mr. Cosby, dedicated to other clients. He represents Miles University in Alabama, one of the historic black colleges, does a fabulous job for them. I have no criticism of anything he did.
Okay.
I thought he was a great publicist and a great spokesperson for the Cosbys. I really do.
Yeah, it seemed to, you know, the battles that were going on outside the courtroom. I was concerned that would sort of.
I wasn't part of any of that.
No. I understand that.
We showed up for trial. We didn't comment. We went into the courtroom. We did our work. We went back and prepared for the next day.
And even, you know, again, I know personally, because I knew a lot of the reporters as well, but like with Michael Jackson, I appreciated the gag order, because then you didn't have to be rude. You could just not speak to somebody. We had a gag order. We didn't have that in Cosby. And I know it's not your style to go and stand in front of a camera and talk to the media.
No, I mean, there have been times when I've done it. During the Robert Blake preliminary hearing, I did it because, in my opinion, the prosecution and the Los Angeles Police Department had so poisoned the media with all of these leaks. I mean, I would look at a police report and see a certain phraseology, and then I would look at the National Enquirer, and there was an article with the same phraseology. It was obvious they were trying to skew public opinion. So I spoke a little more in that one. But my style is to try cases in the courtroom.
Right.
Not the media. I think that's what our system is supposed to be.
Yeah. And I guess I'm not really surprised that the judge didn't issue a gag order. But like I said, in Jackson, it was nice to have that lurking in the background. When the verdicts came in, I don't know if you remember, when we were in trial in Jackson, the verdict came in on Blake. And AP reporter Linda Deutsch had to pull me aside and get special permission from a police officer to tell me the verdict. That was while the trial was going on. Anyway, so we'll be back in a few minutes with Tom. Again, we're welcome to take your calls, area 818-850-7784. Thanks for listening. Hello?
Go ahead, caller.
Okay.
Hello?
Hello?
Go ahead,
Hello?
caller. Go ahead, caller.
You're on.
So I have a question, Mr. Mesereau.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I want to find out, does he think that Mr. Cosby is going to be able to survive any sort of prison sentence in light of his age and his medical condition? And also, he mentioned something about pain and discomfort after the verdict. Could he give a little bit more of a description on, how Cosby and his family reacted to the verdict?
Well, there was great disappointment. The entire defense team, as well as the Cosby family, was extremely disappointed. We don't think he's guilty of anything. We don't think he broke any law. He's always maintained his innocence, and he was a delightful person to work with. I hope he doesn't go to prison, and there's a chance he won't. I think there are so many issues to be resolved. The trial was not fair from A to Z. And hopefully he never sets foot in a prison, and hopefully he gets a fair trial, which he never had.
Does that answer your question? I guess so. Okay, we lost him. Let me ask you, and I don't want to say in contrast, but did you feel that Michael had a fair trial?
The environment was terribly against Michael, but I did feel the judge made a lot of very fair rulings, and I felt he did get a fair trial. Yes. A lot of people thought he couldn't, and in the end, I think he did. I think the trial judge, who in my opinion was pro-prosecution, but also seemed very, very eager to give Michael a fair shake. And, take that trial, for instance. The judge allowed in testimony that Michael had allegedly mistreated other young men. And it went back as much as 10 years. Nobody even imagined other accusers coming in beyond, roughly 10 years.
Yeah.
The Cosby case, you let in witnesses saying approximately 30 years ago I was mistreated. These cases were never investigated, never prosecuted. It's almost impossible now to find witnesses who remember the details of what was being alleged. It was insane, in my opinion. I couldn't believe we were sitting there being subjected to this, and it was such a distraction from the underlying allegations. They should have, the judge should have insisted that the focus be on the primary allegations against him and not bring in all of this extraneous emotional information that, in my opinion, was just there to distract.
You know, one of the things personally that I was disturbed about with the, quote, prior bad act witnesses was the use of the term mentor. Everybody kept saying that Mr. Cosby was their mentor, and Mr. Cosby never said that to anybody. So, again, this was their own perception, and they felt violated by their, quote, mentor, which was absurd. People, in fact, one of the witnesses said she had no idea, nothing happened.
Well, again, you're talking about events going back as much as 30 years ago. And what were people like then as opposed to what are they like now? What was society like then as opposed to what it's like now? And how did people behave in Hollywood and at parties and things, you know, of that sort then as opposed to now? It was, in my opinion, just designed to distract. You know, we had tried to remove the judge because his wife counsels victims of sexual assault, and apparently is a very, very dedicated, very intelligent advocate for victims of sexual assault. We tried to get the judge to step down because we thought that alone might result in some prejudice, and that will be an issue on appeal as well. And there are going to be a lot of other issues coming up that I haven't had time to even talk about. So my point is this: whether you like the prosecution or not, whether you like the defense or not, he had a right to a fair trial, and he never received one. And that's very unfortunate for all of us, because we're all better off when due process is accorded to everyone, no matter who they are, where they're from, what wealth they have, how famous they may be. It doesn't matter. Everyone's supposed to be equal in a courtroom. We're not supposed to treat anyone differently because of who they are. And unfortunately, I think that's what happened in this case. It's got to be changed. These convictions have to be set aside, and he needs to get a fair trial.
Yeah, it happens, unfortunately, in all of the high-profile cases, and everybody thinks they're trying to buy their way out when they go out and hire big attorneys like yourself. And
well, but that's just a misnomer, because if you really look statistically at celebrities who are charged with crimes, the vast majority are convicted. They're not buying their way out of anything.
I had a reporter.
If anything, I've always said that the prosecution will throw resources at a defendant who is perceived as a celebrity more than they will at anyone else. I call it celebrity injustice. Celebrities are treated much more harshly, and much more resources are thrown at them than the average person. That also is wrong, because the decision to allocate more resources to try and convict someone becomes a political decision. It becomes wrapped up in races for judgeships, races for district attorney. To mix politics with the law the way it was in this case is very, very disconcerting, very, very disappointing.
And it was actually very prominent in this case.
It's very prominent. In my opinion, this case was politically inspired and politically driven, and continues to be.
Right. I did an interview shortly after Michael's acquittal, and was told by a reporter that celebrities don't get convicted. And at that point, it was very timely. I said, Martha Stewart, what do you mean celebrities don't get convicted? Martha Stewart was sitting in a federal prison. And this reporter's response was, well, that was the East Coast. It doesn't count.
No, the reporter didn't do his or her homework, because the vast majority of celebrities who are charged with crimes either plead guilty or are convicted. This notion that they buy their way out of justice is ridiculous.
Completely ridiculous. And unfortunately, the theoretical upside of these types of cases is if the media and the public are watching, that you're going to get a much more fair trial. And I see that more and more and more, that it's actually not true.
No, people look, we're human beings. We're driven by emotions. We're driven by passions. We're driven by intellect. We're driven by a combination of things that are inherent to ourselves. And in celebrity cases, passion and emotion start to take control, because the media sees these things as an opportunity to be sensationalizing, what's supposed to be a very professional process. And they just start dealing with sound bites and scandal and making mountains out of molehills, and it really does threaten our system of justice. It's something we have to be continually vigilant against, or otherwise it'll just run amok.
Let me ask you, I want to go back to the pro bono cases. When you show up in a courtroom, how is that perceived down in Alabama or Mississippi?
Well, I've been doing it for 20 years. I feel like Birmingham's home.
All right, but that's fine. But I'm saying when you show up and you're standing in front of jurors and they all know that you were at one point Michael Jackson's attorney or Bill Cosby's or whatever the case, that you have had all these celebrity cases through the years.
I just don't worry about it. I blot it out. I'm who I am, and I hope at some point in a courtroom, anyone who prejudges me will see that I'm a decent, dedicated advocate for justice, and that's what I hope they'll learn. And I'll tell you this about courtrooms: I think jurors are under oath, and within a few days, maximum, they know who the lawyer is. If the lawyer's a fake or a phony, they'll know it. If the lawyer is sincere, has humility and dedication, they'll know it as well.
Right. People see you all the time. I get comments that people have run into you or seen you all the time, and people don't approach you, and I tell them to approach you because they don't know you.
Well, thanks,
and I tell people all the time to approach you. I'm not going to waste our time, but my favorite story was when you and I were up in San Francisco. The guy that saw you standing there asked me, isn't that Michael Jackson's lawyer? And I said, yeah, I think so. Let's go talk to him. When we were at the airport, remember?
That's right.
I dragged this poor guy over and I said, yeah, let's go talk to him. What do we care? What do we care? And then when I handed Tom his sandwich, the guy freaked out. But you visited with him. He had a really nice time, a nice chat. And, I don't know why people think you're not approachable.
I live my life my way.
You do.
I am who I am. What can I say?
You're one of my favorite people.
Oh, thank you.
So how much longer do you plan on doing this? You got a trial coming up in Texas.
Trial coming up in Texas in the fall, and I'm going to be practicing till I drop.
Really?
I like what I do.
Yeah, I think Harlan's going to die in his office too. I keep having that conversation with him. So what else would you like to talk about? You're doing a show. What's the TV show you're doing this evening?
I'm going to do Inside Edition.
Okay.
Okay, and I like Inside Edition. I've dealt with the producers and the staff at Inside Edition for years, and I find them to be very professional with me. They're very nice people to deal with. So I'll be interviewing with them.
Are they coming out to your office? Are you going to them?
They are.
Okay. So you had to get dressed, not for me, certainly, but you had to get dressed. Okay. Do you know when it's airing, the show?
I don't know. Don't know.
They didn't tell you that? Okay.
Didn't ask them, didn't tell me. I just know they're interviewing me this afternoon.
All right. Well, like I said, you're listening to All Things PI. Anybody has any more questions for Tom? Anybody wants to call in? You're welcome to. We'll be here next week with Harlan Braun. Harlan's going to be talking about his client, Roman Polanski. Again, same thing. We'll be able to take calls for Harlan if you want. And he'll be talking about Roman's, Mr. Polanski's conviction, his leaving, and now getting, same with Mr. Cosby, I guess, got tossed out of the academy without any kind of a proper hearing.
That's my understanding.
Was invited to leave, yeah.
Again, these things are happening left and right, and they're so wrong.
Yeah.
They represent a groundswell of passion and public opinion. And the first thing to disappear in a situation like this are civil liberties. We have to fight to keep civil liberties.